Good morning. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us at this webinar to present Trinidad and Tobago's NDC Implementation Plan. As most of you would know, if not, the plan that we hope to present this morning represents a few years of work in the making that culminated in the implementation plan and the NDC in particular. Some years ago, Trinidad and Tobago recognized the need to develop strategies for reducing carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in the bigger sectors. This started in 2009 and culminated in the carbon reduction strategy in late 2014, early 2015, which also coincided with the Paris Agreement decisions of Warsaw that invited countries to present their intended nationally determined contributions well ahead of the Paris Agreement. And Trinidad and Tobago was the first country in the Caribbean to do that. Having culled the implementation plan, or not the implementation plan, the NDC rather, from the carbon reduction strategy that seeks to reduce emissions from the power generation, transportation, and industrial sectors. These sectors being the most significant emitting sectors in the economy of Trinidad and Tobago. The plan that you will be presented this morning outlines the efforts that Trinidad and Tobago has been undertaking, but hopes to undertake until 2030, which is the timeline of the government's NDC in the first instance, and seeks to reduce cumulative emissions from the transport, power generation, and the industrial sectors. We hope that part of this plan will be funded internationally through multilateral funding, as part of the NDC also commits to unconditionally reducing emissions from the transport sector. And I'm pleased to say that we already started implementing our NDC and have already started to achieve emissions reductions since our NDC in the transportation sector seeks to look at 2013 as the reference point based on a business as usual trajectory to 2030. So I will not steal the thunder of my colleagues. We are joined this morning by Mr. Hans Schulz, who's the project manager of the LECB project that forms the wider sort of program from which the NDC implementation plan was culled. Ms. Rosemary Lal from UNDP. UNDP has been supporting the development of the NDC implementation plan and the LECB project. Ms. Cindy Singh, who is the climate change specialist at the Ministry of Planning and Development, Environmental Policy and Planning Division, and Ms. Tasha Jatan Singh, who actually developed the NDC implementation plan. My name, by the way, is Kishan Kumar Singh. I'm head of the Multilateral Environmental Agreements Unit at the Ministry of Planning and Development, and in charge of implementing and overseeing activities related to multilateral environmental agreements, including climate change. This is an exciting time for us at the ministry since we are about to embark on a program and a plan that will see development along a low carbon trajectory, which is consistent with government's policy. With that said, welcome again, and I'll pass you to Ms. Rosemary Lal of UNDP to give us a few words of welcome on behalf of UNDP, who has been supporting this project.
Hello everyone. On behalf of UNDP Trinidad and Tobago, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on the Trinidad and Tobago NDC Implementation Plan, developed under the Global Low Emission Capacity Building Program. I am Rosemary Lal, Program Officer for Energy, Environment and Disaster Management at the UNDP office in Trinidad. Support to Trinidad and Tobago in the development of programs and strategies to achieve its national carbon reduction goals forms a key component of the work we do at this office. The NDC Implementation Plan was the result of work undertaken under the Low Emission Capacity Building, or LECB program, which provided grant funds necessary for the program to be implemented through the UNDP. Prior to this, the pillars upon which the implementation plan was based were developed. These included the National Carbon Reduction Strategy and the Nationally Appropriate Mitigation Actions, or NAMAs, which were the result of partnership projects between the UNDP Trinidad and Tobago office and the Ministry of Planning and Development, and the NAMAs were actually developed under the same LECB program as the NDC implementation plan. The formulation of the plan was successfully achieved due to the effective collaboration between the government of Trinidad and Tobago, the many stakeholders throughout the relevant sectors of power generation, transportation, and heavy industry, the Low Emission Capacity Building Program Unit, based at our UNDP headquarters, and the project assurance, oversight, and operation support of the team at UNDP Trinidad and Tobago. The initiative also benefited greatly from the dedicated support of a project team hired specifically to lead this national program, with technical expertise brought in as required. The result was a comprehensive plan based on a participatory approach. The following session will provide the background and context of this plan, the methodology used in its formulation, and the lessons learned. A recording of the webinar will be available on the blog of the Environmental Policy and Planning Division of the Ministry of Planning and Development. It will also be posted to the UNDP Trinidad and Tobago YouTube site and Facebook page. We will be opening the floor for questions at the end of the presentations. Please send these via the chat option available. We do hope you find this webinar informative and useful in your own climate change mitigation efforts. And now, back to Kishan.
With those few words of welcome on behalf of UNDP and setting the context for the presentation, I pass directly to Ms. Cindy Singh and Ms. Jatan Singh to present the NDC Implementation Plan.
Hi, good morning everyone. Cindy here with you. I will start by giving a brief country overview before we get into the elements of the NDC Implementation Plan. As you know, we are a small island developing state in the Caribbean with a population of approximately 1.4 million people, with our main economic activity being in the energy and petrochemical industry, which accounts for about 40% of our GDP. We are also, as a small island developing state, especially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, which include temperature increases, changes to precipitation, sea level rise, etc. However, we are also a emitter of greenhouse gas, which accounts for about 1% of absolute global emissions nationally. And those emissions come mainly from the power generation, transport, and industry sectors. As of 2012, which we collected this data for the carbon reduction strategy, the power generation sector accounted for 19% of emissions, transport accounted for 8%, and the industry sector accounted for the lion's share of 73% of emissions. In terms of our main climate change initiatives, I'll start with what you all are very familiar with, the National Climate Change Policy, which was laid in Parliament in 2011. It provides broad policy guidance for the development of an appropriate administrative and legislative framework for pursuing a low-carbon development pathway. It provides objectives and strategies for climate change mitigation and adaptation, and includes provisions for renewable energy, clean technologies, and research and development. After that, we embarked on the development of a carbon reduction strategy, which was finalized and approved by Cabinet in 2015. The CRS, as we call it, includes historical CO2 emissions, and it defines business as usual scenarios. It also proposes a suite of climate change mitigation measures for the power generation, transport, and industry sectors. And those mitigation measures were studied. We were able to come up with emissions avoided, conducted cost-benefit analysis, as well as multi-criteria analysis. As Mr. Kumar Singh indicated earlier, it also formed the basis for the Trinidad and Tobago Nationally Determined Contribution, which was submitted that same year, 2015. As you already know, the NDC of Trinidad and Tobago committed to an overall reduction in cumulative emissions from the three main emitting sectors by 15% by 2030 from the business as usual, which is the equivalent of 103 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. There's also an unconditional target of reduction of emissions by 30%, or 1.7 million tons of CO2 equivalent compared to 2013 levels by December 31st, 2030. The estimated cost of implementation of both these targets is approximately $2 billion, and these funds are expected to be met partly through domestic sources as well as international financing, not limited to, but including the Green Climate Fund. As indicated by Ms. Lal earlier, we are also undertaking the low emission capacity building program. We started in 2014, and at that point there were about 25 participating countries, and we were the only SIDS at that point. That has since changed. The main objectives were to develop nationally appropriate mitigation actions, to design the MRV system for Trinidad and Tobago, and then we had the additional component of developing an implementation plan for the NDC. Well, these were the activities of the LECB project, which you are all very well familiar with, so I won't go over those again. And now I will pass you over to Ms. Jatan Singh, who will go through the methodology which she used to develop the NDC implementation plan.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you to Cindy and to Kishan and Rosemary for introducing the project and the NDC implementation plan. As you know, I am the project consultant tasked with developing the NDC implementation plan for Trinidad and Tobago under the LECB project. And what's interesting is that when we decided to develop this plan, Trinidad and Tobago is actually one of the first countries to move forward in committing to the NDC and developing this plan, this implementation plan. And in that being said, we had to really look at what existed prior and what sort of guidance was available from the international community to help us formulate a plan that would be suitable and appropriate for countries. And in that being said, there are two frameworks that have been put forward by the UNDP and by Renewable Energy and Environment and CDKN. And I utilized that in developing the methodology for the implementation plan. These frameworks actually said that the key elements for any implementation plan should consider governance, mitigation, adaptation, measurement, reporting, and verification, MRV, as well as finance as key components for an implementation plan. And the plan should also consider forward planning for future NDC rounds, since the Paris Agreement and countries have committed to ramping up ambition for future NDCs. So this is the main process that I use for developing the NDC implementation plan. The timeline for the substantive work was about 8 months, between June 2016 to January 2017. And as Rosemary said, I intended to use a collaborative and participatory approach in developing this NDC implementation plan. And I really sought to include diverse stakeholders from the three main greenhouse gas emitting sectors of transportation, power generation, and industry in Trinidad and Tobago, not just to provide feedback and to provide research and data, but to be involved in decision making of what sort of measures and should form part of their implementation in their particular sectors. So I'm really glad that happened, in that the stakeholders were very much committed and supported this approach. Data analysis for this plan comprised primarily qualitative due to limitations with data availability and accessibility. That being said, the recommendations coming out of the research in developing the plan really look towards strengthening and building a research and data collection system within the three sectors for climate change data that would help to support implementation of the NDC, as well as when we do forward planning for future NDC rounds. Coming out of the research and data collection and analysis, we developed recommendations that form the key elements of the implementation plan, and that included a capacity building plan, sectoral plans for the three sectors, and a climate finance plan. In terms of the methods for the NDC implementation plan, Firstly, of course, we had to do a desktop review, and we looked at existing policies, reports, projects, such as the carbon reduction strategy, the NDC, and work that was done in the LECB project. We also looked internationally as well. Next was stakeholder identification, and we really utilized the networks that were built from previous projects, such as what was done in the carbon reduction strategy, as well as the development of the numbers under the LECB program. And the stakeholders came from the three sectors, and they were quite varied and diverse, coming from public sector, private sector, academia, and the NGO sector. In terms of stakeholder engagement, as I said, we wanted a participatory and involved approach. So what we did was that we sought to really engage stakeholders through different measures that would become increasingly more involved as the plan was developed. So what we started with was online surveys for the institutional capacity assessments, and that was followed by interviews with individual stakeholders. Next, we sought to bring key stakeholders from the power generation, transport, and industry sectors and Tobago together in focus groups in order for them to put forward recommendations and put forward measures that would be feasible for their sectoral plans and their vision for how they could move forward in implementing the NDC in their particular sectors. And of course, next we had follow-up, where stakeholders were involved in the review of the NDC plan throughout the different phases, and provided valuable feedback that went into the final plan. In terms of data analysis, as I said, we did utilize a qualitative approach. So some of the data analysis tools that we used was a SWOT analysis and an issue tree analysis. In terms of review and final approval, that took about 2 months between February and March. Of course, it went through various rounds of stakeholder review, and we got final approval by in March from the project steering committee. And from that, it was handed over to the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. So this is the elements of the NDC implementation plan, and it's mainly based on the work that was done with the various stakeholders. And the recommendations mainly are to strengthen the institutional capacity for the NDC in the three sectors and to mainstream the climate change issues into the existing policy and legislative framework to create the enabling environment for implementation of the NDC. In terms of the plans for implementing the NDC, as I've said before, one was the capacity building action plan, and we felt that capacity building is necessary in order to ensure that we have the proper institutions and systems in place to fully implement the NDC later on. We also developed sectoral plans, as I said before, for the power generation, transport, and industry sectors, and that includes mitigation actions, projects, activities, as well as the implementation schedule, potential emissions avoided, and the estimated cost, and that was done in collaboration with the various stakeholders. And finally, we developed a climate finance plan, since financing and funding for the implementation plan is necessary in order to move forward. So this is just an overview of the methodology for the NDC implementation plan that I utilized. So now I will give the floor back to Ms. Cindy Singh to really go more in depth about the elements of the NDC implementation plan.
Thank you, Sasha. Cindy here again with you. So as Sasha mentioned, there were several key recommendations coming out of her discussions with all the stakeholders. One of those key recommendations was for the strengthening of institutional capacity Based on the institutional capacity assessment survey conducted, several implementation areas were identified and examples of recommendations are listed on this slide. So one of the first implementation area was for policy and legislative framework, which would mean an improvement of the enforcement capacity of relevant laws and policies nationally. In terms of resources, a potential resource would be the establishment of the National GHG Emissions Repository. In terms of coordination and political commitment, there is a need for the formalization of a lead agency to coordinate and champion climate change issues as well as carbon reduction measures in Trinidad and Tobago. In terms of the awareness of climate change issues and carbon reduction measures, there is a need for conducting a knowledge, attitudes, and practices study to inform appropriate climate change awareness activities. There is also a need under the implementation area for knowledge of climate change research and data collection for the establishment of a research and development agenda on climate change issues through a consultative process with key stakeholders. The second key recommendation coming out of all the discussions with the stakeholders was for the mainstreaming of climate change issues into national development as well as for carbon reduction measures. Now, they identified several levels at which this mainstreaming can occur, the first of which is at the national level. An example of this would be the review and reform of the local green fund to allow for new funding mechanisms to facilitate the implementation of the NDC. At the sectoral level, there is need to develop guidance for integrating climate change issues into sectoral policies, plans, legislation, and projects for the various stakeholders. At the organizational level, an example of the recommendation is to embed climate change into organizational structures of ministries and agencies. At the project level, there is need to include climate change considerations in the evaluation criteria for assessing project proposals by ministries and agencies. The third recommendation was for the establishment of institutional arrangements. The triangle indicates the levels at which this institutional arrangement can be done, and this is in alignment with the carbon reduction strategy. So the NDC implementation plan proposes that the institutional arrangements could be facilitated at 3 levels. So at the lowest level, at the bottom tier there, you would notice that there is need for sectoral implementation of the strategy through the establishment of subcommittees. The middle tier indicates the level for subcommittee coordination, and this would be done by the MEAU or the Multilateral Environmental Agreements Unit at the Ministry of Planning. That's the proposal. At this level is where the climate change focal point network would also be nested and managed. And at the top tier, you would notice that's where the climate change ministerial committee would operate, and the various ministers with responsibility would include environment, energy, finance, public utilities, transport, local government, health, housing, planning, agriculture, tourism, and the Tobago House of Assembly. The roles and responsibilities of the Climate Change Ministerial Committee Secretariat would include management of the Climate Change Focal Point Network, coordination of information dissemination to the Focal Point Network, including updates on international climate change negotiations, defining the roles and responsibilities and information sharing procedures relevant to the implementation of the NDC, establishment of the various technical subcommittees, coordinating public awareness and sectoral awareness strategies on climate change, and monitoring and reporting on the implementation of carbon reduction measures. In terms of the various action plans produced by the NDC Implementation Plan, the first of which is a capacity building action plan which seeks to strengthen the existing frameworks for carbon reduction measures in Trinidad and Tobago. One such action is the setting up of the formal institutional arrangements for the implementation of the NDC. An example of the activity would be the creation of a formal technical or policy unit that would be the Climate Change Ministerial Committee Secretariat, which would provide the coordination role for the implementation of the NDC. Second action would be the increase in awareness on climate change, and this would be an example of an activity would be the development and implementation of stakeholder awareness programs on national climate change policy and legislative framework. Third action would be building capacity to implement the NDC, and an example of the activity would be the development and implementation of sectoral capacity building programs on GHG emissions monitoring and reporting requirements. In terms of promotion of knowledge and research on climate change, an example of an activity would be to support the research and data collection activities which are aligned to the sectoral climate change priorities. The fifth example of an action here under the Capacity Building Action Plan would be to strengthen the policy and legislative framework for climate change. An example of the activity would be the amendment and harmonization of the policies and legislation in the various sectors to implement carbon reduction measures. Then there were the sectoral plans, which, as mentioned before, we looked at the power generation, transport, and industry sector. And these plans were developed based on the NAMAs that were developed under the LECB program, with also consideration of the findings of the carbon reduction strategy, as well as various stakeholder consultations and focus groups conducted by Ms. Jatan Singh. In the power generation sector, the mitigation measures that they came up with included the review of energy pricing, promotion of energy conservation and efficiency, promotion of renewable energy and alternative energy, promotion of knowledge and awareness, development of a feed-in tariff program, and last but not least, the integration of all of this into the national MRV system. And altogether, this is supposed to account for about 28.7 million tons of CO2 equivalent and cost about $945 million US. In the transport sector, there is a need for the creation of the enabling environment, so that is the policy framework, which is currently lacking. The improvement of national public transport system, promotion of vehicle energy efficiency and fuel switching, promotion of alternative fuels in the transport sector, reduction of private vehicle use, promotion of fuel efficiency, improvement of data collection and information sharing systems, and last but not least, again, the integration of all of this into the national MRV framework. Altogether, this is supposed to account for 2.6 million tons of CO2 equivalent in greenhouse gas emissions reductions and cost about US $735 million. In the industry sector, which includes both the upstream and downstream sectors, the sectoral plan included actions for the promotion of energy conservation and efficiency, promotion of renewable energy and alternative energy in the industry sector, establishment of a pilot market mechanism, promotion of fuel conservation, promotion of knowledge and management awareness, and integration of all of this into the national MRV framework. Altogether, this is supposed to account for 72 million tons of CO2 equivalent in emission reductions and cost around US $320 million, which should bring us to a total of 103 million tons of reductions to the tune of US $2 billion, as indicated in the NDC. The Climate Finance Plan basically outlines how all of these activities could be funded. It made recommendations for the setting up of the institutional arrangements for financing the NDC, identification of the funding gaps and needs, assessment of public and private financing options, development of sectoral climate finance plans, accessing various international climate funds which may have opportunities for direct access, development of a project pipeline and funding proposals, increasing the private sector engagement and investment, and integrating all of this into the national MRV system. In terms of potential sources of funding, there's the National Green Fund, not to be confused with the Green Climate Fund. There's the Public Sector Investment Program, PSIP as we know it, the International NAMA Facility, the Clean Development Mechanism, the Global Environment Facility, the Jeff Small Grants Program, the International Finance Corporation, the Green Climate Fund, the Sustainable Energy and Climate Change Initiative, as well as the International Climate Initiative. In terms of the NDC Implementation Plan next steps, well, the Implementation Plan outlines the main recommendations as well as the activities which would allow for the target to be reached. What is next to be done is for us to obtain the approval of Cabinet and then to begin implementation. And as we implement, to continue to measure, report, and verify the progress of the actions being undertaken. With all of that being said, I thank you for your attention, and I pass you back to Mr. Kumar Singh for question and answers.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you, Sasha, for a very comprehensive presentation and walkthrough of the NDC implementation plan. You would agree that that it gave a lot of food for thought, and I trust that that we would be able to be in a position to answer your questions if you have any. With that said, then I open the floor for any questions that the participating audience may have, and we will try to answer them. Floor is open. Please identify yourself if you can, if you want, and where you're from, so that we can get an idea of the range of participation.
Okay, so the first question from Dr. Deborah Cornman. Will Trinidad and Tobago ratify the Paris Agreement? Does that have any implications for the implementation of the plan?
Okay, thank you, Deborah, for that question. First, let me say that the consideration of ratification is with the cabinet of Trinidad and Tobago, and they are going through their internal processes to facilitate ratification, which we hope will happen very soon. It is unlikely that Trinidad and Tobago will not ratify, but just to answer your second part of the question, for purely academic purposes, in the event that we do not ratify, the NDC implementation plan and the NDC itself, as you will recall, we mentioned early in the webinar, has been culled from a carbon reduction strategy, which is official government policy and which is a strategy for reducing carbon emissions, so that the pursuit of those emission reductions will continue whether we ratify or not.
From Efficiency One Services, what activities constitute promotion of energy efficiency in each sector? In terms of promotion of energy efficiency initiatives, the plan actually goes through quite comprehensively what those energy efficiency measures would be, and it would be specific for each sector. So transport would have their own, be it fuel switching and so forth. Industry would have their own, if it's reduction of gas flaring, and also power generation would have their own energy efficiency measures as well. So I hope that helps.
Just to add, but once implementing actions requires input of government, then at the time of implementation, we will be engaging stakeholders to sort of debug the system and to further clarify the details in order to have successful implementation. So the broad implementation plan, the broad action is to engender and promote energy efficiency. That can be done through consultations to arrive at various approaches. We have had some feedback from industry during the development of the NDC and the NAMAs that suggests that the industry may be amenable to looking at incentives that would facilitate their conversion to more efficient technology. So along those lines, we will be engaging with stakeholders in a more detailed manner, an action-specific manner to arrive at suitable.
Next question from Nicola Atlantic. My question is on the policy and legislative framework. What is being done? What legislation?
Okay, thank you, Angela. We have conducted, as you probably are aware, a comprehensive policy analysis and legislative analysis that would identify gaps in the legislative framework and policy framework to be filled in order to fully implement the NDC, and by extension the implementation plan. So it is difficult to say at this point what existing legislation will be used, but there are existing legislation on the statute books that can be used to implement parts of this plan, and those that are where the gaps are, those that are not present will fill through appropriate formulation and policy formulation.
From Ellen Tweed, what is the proposed timeline to really improve the policy and law for the introduction of renewable energy?
Well, that exercise or the activities towards that end are already in train. The Ministry of Public Utilities already looking at the existing regulatory framework for generation and distribution of energy through the TNTEC Framework Act, or the act that governs TNTEC. And there's also a draft, which you may be aware, of feed-in tariff policy that is being finalized to facilitate the vision of the TNTEC Act to allow for renewable energy to be fed onto the grid. And as well, there's already also a commitment of government for a 10% renewable target by 2021, which is being acted this year, both by the Ministry of Public.
The next couple of questions are regarding the cabinet approval and how, well, the timeline for it. When do you anticipate approval, and will the board also address the legislative proposal?
The recommendation of the cabinet to approve the project, of course, will approve the plan rather will of course identify all that is needed at the policy level to facilitate implementation, including legislative gaps, policy gaps. Of course, this will be done progressively over time, because as you would appreciate, as been said by Cindy and Sasha, the enabling environment first needs to be put in place, and that includes legislative and policy environments. So that will probably be given some priority in terms of actions to be taken in the short term. With respect to cabinet approval, cabinet, of course, as you would appreciate, sets its own agenda, but we are hoping for an approval in the very near future, certainly within the next month. But as I said, all depends on cabinet decision.
From the Environmental Management Authority, it was mentioned during the presentation on the implementation plan that two action areas are: one, the revision of legislative and policy frameworks, and two, to establish a greenhouse gas repository. Has the ministry identified the legislation to be amended, as well as the entity that would serve as the repository for this?
No, that is yet to be done. The MRV system will, when we roll out the MRV system and the pilot of the MRV system during the phase 2 of the LECB project, those results will inform the best arrangements for housing the repository. The MRV system, as you're aware, is for measurement, reporting, and verification. So that whole system will have its own sort of individual setup and requirements for operating smoothly within the broader NDC implementation. So once we look at the legal underpinnings for the MRV system, which is the next step under the LECB2, we will be able to identify what is needed, what is adequate, whether it exists or not, and how it can be amended, and what arrangements will be the best suited to facilitate a functional and efficient MRV system for NDC tracking.
Second question from the EMA. It was mentioned that the total cost of these plans would be $2 billion US. Does the finance plan provide more detail with respect to how much of that $2 billion will come from domestic?
No, it does not. What we have identified in the NDC is that there will be an unconditional commitment to reducing emissions in the transport sector, which has already been begun to be implemented through fuel switching to CNG through the CNG program. The quantification of how much comes from domestic, as you would appreciate, cannot be set in stone very early, because as we roll out the individual actions to achieve the implementation, those actions will of course be in terms of budgeted, so that whether it can be done through ESIP funding, or whether it can be done through grant funding, or whether through multilateral funding will be decided then. There is no indication as of now as to what portion will be required to be funded internationally, or what will be funded domestically. Of course, economies and finance are very volatile and dynamic things, and the current environment is a testament to that. So as we go forward in implementing and identifying financing these specific actions, we will determine then what can be
Najula, the second question, she's interested in the pilot market mechanism project. So who is driving this, and what information is available at this?
Yeah, well, Najula, as you probably are also aware, the Energy Chamber has actually started to look at the concept of a market mechanism, of a carbon trading scheme. This initiative has now been taken up by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change through its St. George's Grenada office, and they are now conceptualizing a program that will see a sort of Caribbean-wide project being developed, or program being developed. Of course, all of this will be premised on the outcomes of the rules now being negotiated for the implementation of the Paris Agreement under the ad hoc working group on the Paris Agreement. So, specifically under Article 6, which speaks to a market mechanism. So, depending on how the rules evolve, that will inform how the pilot carbon trading or market mechanism design. But it's a work in progress through a collaborative effort within the region and the United Nations through the Grenada office.
Glenn from the PTP. Can you remind us how the business as usual future projections will determine and what confidence you have in it?
Okay, as with all projections, Glenn, you would appreciate that they're fraught with uncertainty, and it's only as good as the data at that time allows. The business as usual was done. The projection, the baseline was done using data that was gathered on a model that was specifically tailored by the consultants to cater for Trinidad and Tobago's situations, economic situations, socio-economic situations, and so on. What we hope to do as we go along is to revise the baseline periodically and update the baseline with the data that will come forth, whether that data is updated or whether it can fill the gaps that we identified during the initial construction of the baseline. So the baseline is not cast in stone, as all baselines are. So it will be reconstructed, if you want, or revised or revalidated as we go forward, depending on the availability of data and changing in socioeconomic data.
Angelo provided another comment that the EMA is currently requesting data from companies as part of the registration. What will be done with this data that is being collected by the EMA to facilitate the data available to the end?
Well, as you would have seen in the presentation, the whole aspect of monitoring, measuring, and reporting and verifying emissions will have to be done in a coordinated and consolidated manner, so that wherever the repository for the emissions are housed or is housed, whatever data is being collected by the EMA now will certainly feed into that database. And we are at the moment looking at setting up the knowledge management system of the MRV, the KMS, which is basically a database. We will be working with the EMA closely. As you know, the EMA is the only regulatory body with an environmental mandate in the country, so that we hope to work with them closely. They fall within the remit of the Ministry of Planning in any event, so that the data that they will be collecting will also be used the MRV system at some point. Well, I want to thank all participants for spending the last hour or so with us. And we were very happy to hear your questions. It actually did also engender some food for thought on our end in going forward in implementing the NDC. Please, for those of you who are from Trinidad and Tobago, please, if you have any other questions that you may wish to ask of us, or any other comments that you may wish to contribute, you can so do by emailing Tanya, whose email you have, who have been liaising with you and alluding you to this webinar. I just want to underscore that the implementation plan and NDC implementation plan and NDCs is a new thing for every country of the world. So this is not something that has been tried and true. This is, as you would appreciate, a work in progress. It's not cast in stone, and therefore will be subject to revisions or even many revisions as we go along in implementing. But suffice it to say, the philosophical and the ideological basis on which the NDC is premised is against the Paris Agreement, and that is to contribute to reducing emissions globally so that we can keep global temperatures at a level that will not cause catastrophic climate change. So we hope to be engaging with you continuously as we go forward, hoping to learn from you and to get your advice, to get feedback from you and comments on how we can do this in a collaborative way in achieving the commitment that Trinidad and Tobago has set itself under the Paris Agreement. I'm going to signal that there's another question. So,
from Adia, from the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards. You said you've been engaged in the development of a number of EE and RE standards, and has any consideration been given to such standards in the legislation?
Thank you. Well, this is good news from the TTBS. It shows that some work is being done, and we hope to look forward to collaborating with you, TTBS, in developing the approaches I spoke of earlier. I also understand that the TTBS has been training on greenhouse gas inventorying. So when we begin to roll out the MRV system, we hope to collaborate with all those entities and it's similar type attitude, and the TTBS is an important player. We hope to learn from you in terms of what your work has produced and how that can be incorporated in any legislation that we develop. Okay, thank you very much, and goodbye.